Welcome to the League of Women Voters of the North Countries Forum. We're very excited to welcome our members and friends in the community to tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'm just going to spend a couple minutes giving you a little information about the League of Women Voters of the North Country. It covers Clinton and Essex County, and we offer many services, including voter registration materials and voter guides, hosting and assisting with candidate forums, building campaigns to increase voter turnout, and hosting regular public forums on a variety of topics, including last month's forum on climate change with Dr. Ray Johnson. Our league provides voter information to area high schools and colleges, and members of the league attend naturalization ceremonies, city, town, and county public meetings, assist as election night reporters for the Associated Press, and volunteer as poll workers for their county's Board of Elections. The leagues at every level work together to be observers of government and advocate on many issues. In New York State, our leagues advocate for equitable access and cost containment in healthcare, streamlining the New York State court system, support legislation to protect natural resources, public health, and the economy from impacts of the fossil fuel industry, and favor the development of renewable energy. The state leagues also support uniform and equitable assessment and property tax systems, as well as fair pay reforms. And here in our state, the league supports measures to expand early voting, supports no excuse absentee voting, and supports reducing the voter registration deadline. The league is nonpartisan, which is not the same thing as bipartisan. Bipartisan means representing both parties, and the league represents no party. The bylaws of the League of Women Voters stipulate that the league shall not support or oppose any political party or candidate. This policy of nonpartisanship has always been a source of strength to the league and is the cornerstone of our voter service efforts. The league's purpose is to promote political responsibility through informed and active participation in government and to act on selected governmental issues. It urges all its members to become fully informed about candidates and issues. And to introduce tonight's forum speaker, Helen Allen Nerska was born and raised in Peru, New York, and after graduating from SUNY Plattsburgh, she worked in Canada for 35 years in senior marketing and administrative positions before returning in 2005 to live as the 7th generation on the family farm in Peru. She was museum manager for the North Star Underground Railroad Museum from 2010 to 2014 and is on the boards of the Saranac chapter of Daughters of the American Revolution, the Adirondack Coast Cultural Alliance, the Northern New York American Canadian Genealogical Society, Women's Rights Alliance of New York, and the League of Women Voters of the North Country, where Carol and myself serve as co-presidents. In January 2012, she was elected president of the Clinton County Historical Association and Museum and took over as director in March of 2017. She currently serves as the full-time director for the association on a volunteer basis. Her personal commitment is preserving and sharing the long, inspiring, and significant history of Clinton County and New York State, and is currently serving as a regional coordinator of Consider the Source, a New York State Archives project to identify and make available primary sources for use by educators across New York. She is the editor and author of the recently published Clinton County Suffrage Story and speaks regularly on women's suffrage history. She's also the editor of the Heritage Corner, published monthly in the Sun Community News. And it is my privilege to introduce a remarkable woman and a colleague that I've been happy to be acquainted with through the League. So Helen, the platform is yours. I am going to spotlight you, and that means you will see her and the screen that she's going to share shortly, and you can make it bigger. So go ahead and start sharing your screen. And if you want to change your view to make it speaker, that might help. And go ahead and unmute.
Okay. I think we're ready. Okay. All right, everybody. Can you hear? I hope you can hear me. These are our, we have discovered that these are probably our fabulous 5 suffragists in Clinton County, although they represent at least 150 more women whose names were in the newspapers at a time when you would equate being a suffragist as being a little odd, or maybe even a lot odd. But these wonderful women, Hannah Straight Lansing, Miriam Dot Parkhurst, Marie Booth, Lillian Pike Everest, and Harriet Dudley Bell. And by the way, that is the only picture I have of Harriet Dudley Bell. It's the only picture her family has of her. And this amazing woman, that's all we have to see, but she was apparently pretty something else. Where do I start to tell the story of women's struggle to gain the right to vote? I started with Clinton County when I first learned that my great-grandfather was an anti-suffragist. In our area, we did not host a large march or have any other nationally recognized event. We did work hard and hosted many events to support suffrage. But why tell our story? Because we have one. We have a story in Clinton County. We have local unsung heroes, men and women who struggled for women's suffrage over a very long period of time. And they were veterans of a battle, and I use the word battle and fight a lot in this presentation because we did. The battle was fought in meeting halls and at home over the dinner table, I am sure. Many didn't live to vote. During Women's History Month, it's important to remember and respect their struggles, and issues still remain, but far fewer than 102 years ago. In 1848, women in the United States did not have the right to vote. They lost everything if they were died or if they were married. They had no right to their wages, no right to their children. They were treated with less than respect, but perhaps it was just respect that got them through. They had no rights. The first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, actually put voting as the last thing on their list, with other rights first. So at the Seneca Falls Convention, their Declaration of Independence simply added that all men and women should be treated equally. It sounds so basic, not complicated, but actually, as it turned out, it was very complicated. The Clinton County story I found began in 1855 with a visit by Susan B. Anthony. She was an agent of the Women's Rights Society of New York at the time, and she was working with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Certainly was inspired by her, actually, but she was around. This visit is significant in 2 ways to us. First of all, it's the first recorded suffrage event in the county. And second, a young girl named Hannah Straight, who went on to be called the mother of Clinton County suffrage, she's one of our fabulous 5, was at this meeting in 1855. You can see the photo that CCHA had a photo of Clinton Hall where Susan B. Anthony spoke. It was apparently a cold day in early February. And she had we were one of 54 counties. She was setting out to meet the people face to face, to ask them to sign a petition to allow women the right to their wages and their children. And it looks like the Plattsburgh Republican Reporter was prepared for a negative deportment, but was happily disappointed. But while complimenting Miss Anthony on her modest and retiring manner, yet giving a strong message, he did conclude by reminding his reader that in no country, now listen to this, in no country better deference paid to women than in the United States. We think she has no right to complain of her social position here. So his conclusion of the event was that since women are respected and socially acceptable, what more could they want? Apparently at this meeting, a local respected judge, Lemuel Stetson, stepped up at this event and defined women who might think Miss Anthony had a point as strong-minded. And remember that description. Other citizens were there, and you can just imagine them all nodding their head. Yeah, I'm strong-minded. I think she spoke for about an hour and a half at that meeting. But the visit impacted the young Hannah Strait, and it may have changed her life. I'm jumping ahead here about 15 years because the women's suffrage movement stalled for the Civil War. There was nothing really recorded or done during the Civil War. It was put aside, the movement was put aside. The Plattsburgh papers were relatively quiet also, but news must have been creeping in from somewhere to the point where a local merchant, this is an ad in the one of the newspapers, maybe the Sentinel, where a local merchant made fun of suffragists by pretending that they would be at this store. Little did this guy know that Anna Dickinson and Wendell Phillips would really be coming to town and attracting an audience the size of which they could only dream to shop at their store. Credit has to be given, and I wish I had a picture of this woman. I would just love to see her. Maybe there's one in Florida somewhere. I'll tell you why after. Credit must be given to her because she was the first local woman who hit the stump for suffrage in Clinton and Essex counties. The Good Templars in every community supported both temperance and suffrage. Ida broached an issue that would be repeated again and again by suffragists. Women needed to be trained the same as men. But Ida, of course, goes further by saying that training would probably raise women to levels above men. So that was her theory. In Ida's September 1870 letter to the Plattsburgh Sentinel, she described herself as strong-minded. So it looks like that the judge's criticism of Susan B. Anthony became a badge of honor. Ida was, however, an actress too. So the article that she wrote is romantic and poetic. But to the point, she said, "Yes, girls, the days of dolls and butterflies have passed. Men want helpmates and companions for wives, not know-nothings." So there's a party of know-nothings, not know-nothings. But in the 1892 census, she was noted as being born in France and with an MD as an occupation, a medical doctor. Ida, unfortunately, for our area, left the area to open a sanitarium in Lake Helen, Florida. And I discovered that structure is still there today. There were two, and I'm going to take this year by year through. I like chronological, but I sometimes flip back. But so we're now moving to 1872. And there were two notable suffrage discussions in 1872. One early in the year, the Young Men's Debating Club hosted a Mr. Herman Veeder, who was the superintendent of the local horse nail factory. He was from Pennsylvania and perhaps really didn't know his audience because he felt that they surely agreed with him that the extension of the rights of women is the fundamental principle of all social progress, and knew his audience and he felt that they would be fearful of this event. Well, I mean, this might have been the first time they'd heard this. His entire pro-suffrage speech was recorded in the Essex County Republican. This paper was published by the Lansing, a local family of human rights activists, which included Hannah Straight, who married the publisher's son in 1870. So we start to see a background sort of influence, perhaps, of Hannah Straight. The argument of paying taxes without the right to vote was one many felt that the male voters could grasp. Later in the year, so he's saying she's compelled to pay taxes on her property without being allowed to have a vote in the regulation of taxation. And that's a theme that streams through the suffrage argument. Later in the year, the Plattsburgh Literary Club hosted a suffrage debate, which might have been entitled, "Am I Not a Citizen?" Women were not defined as citizens. The club was a very conservative group, but at least they were dealing with the subject. Then Anna Dickinson came to town, and I just can imagine this. And she was one of the ones that the retailer was making fun of and said, oh yeah, well, if she was here, but she's not, but she did come. And she was the Joan of Arc of the Civil War. She went out on the stump supporting the Civil War for Lincoln. And now in 1874, she was on the lecture circuit, earning more money than Mark Twain, and she was speaking on suffrage. She took Plattsburgh by storm. There were full descriptions of her manner, her dress, her message in local papers. And her message was, nothing will be handed to you. You can't expect to get something for nothing. The hall that hosted her, Palmer Hall, was packed with citizens. I expect voting and non-voting. And the Hannah Dickinson story was written up in the Lake Champlain Weekly in November of 2016. Mary Livermore came, and she was a journalist, an abolitionist, and an advocate for human rights. She spoke at the new Plattsburgh Academy in 1875 with kudos all around, it would appear. It was the press was very popular, supported this a lot. And you'll see that many, many important names in suffrage did visit our area. Mary was a strong supporter of Lincoln and was president of the American Women's Suffrage Association. Mary died in 1905, and she never got the right to vote. There was a request by the New York State Women's Suffrage Committee in 1876 to ask the New York State Legislature for the right for women to vote. It went nowhere. And the sarcastic Plattsburgh Republicans said, sorry, afraid not. Just as you would respond to a child asking for a third or fourth piece of candy. In January of 1879, Susan B. Anthony returned to Plattsburgh, and she spoke at the Plattsburgh High School. She was reported to be, quotes, toned down, although she seemed as intense. She was seen as intense and earnest and persistent. She spoke on both temperance and suffrage for 2 hours. Clinton County suffragist and one of our fabulous five, Harriet Dudley Bell, was at this meeting, and its impact on her was actually included in her obituary. The reporter for this meeting seemed to have been at the 1855 meeting and compared Susan B. Anthony's style, and also reported that the attendance at the 1855 meeting had been small. It was from this report that we learned, in the report in 1879, that we learned that the Judge Stetson had given her sort of a challenge in 1855. And then I start to think, now, who is this reporter? So we have a reporter that was also in 1855 and a reporter who was here in 1879 in order and could explain, compare the two events. And then again, according to, Wendell Phillips came to town. He was amazing, apparently. He came in February. He followed Susan B. Anthony's visit, and he was hosted by the Young Men's Association. And he received, according to the press, the largest audience in the area's memory. He was an abolitionist and an early advocate for women's rights. He argued that the 14th Amendment should include Native Americans. He died in 1894, and his work was definitely not done. And this is a local judge, respected, Judge Winslow Watson. He spoke out against women doing the same work for half the pay. He understood that the national creed was equal suffrage, yet half the population of the United States was not allowed to vote. Judge Watson and the spouses of many local women supported suffrage. So this is a good one because I know who this guy is. And I came across the divorce decree, and this was 1881, and he was divorced in the city of Plattsburgh. And in this case, the plaintiff, he could remarry, but the divorce decree said that his ex-wife could not remarry until he died. I thought that was interesting. I happened to be with Penny Clute at the time, and she thought that was, she said, "Really, did you read this right?" And I said, "I certainly did." I know he said that he claimed that his wife slept with his cousin who he'd grown up with. And it turns out at this decree, at the court hearing, he was the only one that even testified. So the whole thing is doubtful, but it's a shocking legal document that she had no rights at all. In 1882, a suffrage bill was presented to the New York Assembly and defeated. Our county assemblyman, D.B. Clapp, voted for the suffrage bill, but more voted against it, including Sheedy from Essex County. And it's kind of important to remember that at one point, Clinton County voted for suffrage. By 1890, women's clubs were appearing, and you can see these three. Most suffragists were members of all three. So you could be in the Tuesday Club, the DAR, and the George William Curtis Club and cover all the bases. This latter club was devoted to suffrage, and members were entitled to membership in local, state, and national suffrage groups if you belonged to the George William Curtis Club. He was a philosopher, and apparently upon his death in 1892, suffrage clubs were formed in his name. Members of these clubs included our fabulous five who were active at the time: Hannah Straight Lansing, Harriet Bell, and Marie Booth. And those three ladies would continue to be active in the suffrage movement. So we have the Vote No group started to speak out. And their argument was that since women don't have any physical power to coerce or fight, they should not have the vote. That was one of the arguments. There are many, many other ones that have been written up, but I won't mention them all. I found this, I don't know, I took offense to this. The Shirt Factory ad caught my attention. This guy he was hiring, there was an ad associated with this announcement that he had some 70 girls. The ad did not want boys, men, or women, only girls for this particular job. There was a large push in 1894 to encourage local women to be more active in the suffrage movement. And there was a warming up of the crowd for the county convention done by a couple of women, Sarah Winthrop Smith, and she was from the National Women's Suffrage Association. And these women traveled all to outlying area communities to promote this convention and to promote suffrage as a right of citizenship. As it turned out, Sarah Winthrop Smith died in 1902. at the age of 50 and never got the right to vote. At this convention, we start to see our local suffragists appear again. Hannah Lansing and her daughter, Ida Wilcox, and women from Ausable, Keysville, Beekmantown, Blackbrook, Champlain, Denimora, Ellenburg, Moores, and the 6 Plattsburgh districts. At this convention, there were guest speakers. One was, big names came in. Mary Seymour Howell came. She's from the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she's looking for 1 million signatures throughout New York State, including our county. So there she was for us. She pointed out that the power of the petition was such that eventually they felt through that they would get the power of the vote. Harriet May Mills was also at the convention. She was described, and they described these speakers, of course, and how they look. They didn't say their hair was out of place or anything, but basically they might have. She was described as pleasing and a lady of fine executive ability and address, and she was well placed to win friends for suffrage. This was the report in the newspaper. And Susan B. Anthony made her last visit to Plattsburgh in 1894. She packed the courthouse and received more respect from the reporting on her speech. What's interesting is that the person compared her against the 2 visits prior. So the person that reported on this event was also, I would say, at the other 2 events, because she said she was the same and she was a little different, and so somebody had made knew the differences between those 3 events. And the person I think that did it was Hannah Straight Lansing. She's one of our fabulous 5. She was impressed. She was at the 1855 event, and she went on to be an editor, author, humanitarian, and of course she was a suffragist. She was a Plattsburgh girl, and in 1872, I think she married the son of the owner of the Plattsburgh Sentinel, who was reporting on Susan B. Anthony's visits. And so she married into this family of social activists, and I believe they gave her a voice in telling us how Susan B. Anthony really was during all these meetings. The other thing that Hannah Straight Lansing did was she wrote to and I don't expect you to read this letter. It's barely readable anyway, because it is that special collections. She wrote to the Wyoming governor, John Osborne, asking if suffrage was working. And Wyoming had full suffrage at the time for women, and well, actually since 1869. And he replied immediately to her letter, and he felt that every state would do well following Wyoming's example. And this exact letter that she wrote, received back from him, is in special collections at SUNY Plattsburgh. Hannah headed up this committee, the Women's Suffrage Convention, and headed up the committee which presented the resolution to the New York State Constitutional Convention. They wanted to strike the word male from Article 2, Section 1 of our state convention, our Constitution. The Constitution said every male citizen of the age of 21 years who had been a citizen for 90 days in the country, or at least 30 days of the district, they just want the word male deleted. A local lawyer, Charles Helsley Moore, brought the recommendation of the group to the state constitutional convention, and it was not accepted. All the while, temperance and suffrage groups were not working together, certainly not in Clinton County. Each felt the other would take emphasis away from their cause. Herman Veeder had told people there would be nothing to fear from suffrage, except if you want easy access to liquor, it was thought that the female vote would change that. As years passed, more suffrage clubs emerged and meetings eventually moved out of the houses into permanent locations. In the interest of being seen to consider all opinions, the Political Studies Club advertised that aunties, and aunties are anti-suffragists, were welcome to their meetings. Apparently, the George William Curtis Club made such an impression that its members were personally challenged to show their interest in voting by voting on a bond issue. There was a bond issue, and this was in the newspapers where they were challenged. If they wanted to vote, hey, vote. The bonding issue was June 1st in 1901, and it was to improve streets and sewers, and anyone who had property could vote for this. Well, the bonding issue, it turns out the results were commented on in the paper too. But interesting, there were 1,000 eligible voters, men and women. Only 258 in total voted. 76 were women. Not too much relevance can be given to these numbers since we don't know how many women had property and could have voted. But in any event, the female vote was tracked, and all who voted for the bond issue. One of our fabulous five is Harriet Dudley Bell. I pause here to recognize she as Hannah Straight Lansing, they were she is noted for really having hosted. She was known in every club and often hosted club meetings in her house. She was known as a personality, actually, by my grandmother, whose father, I mentioned, my great-grandfather was, her father was an anti-suffragist. And her obituary says that she was one of the original members of the Susan B. Anthony movement. Hers was one of the few obituaries that mentions involvement in the suffrage movement. But during my research, I was fascinated by the subtle marketing, maybe not so subtle, around elixirs for women. The assumption was that women may not be strong enough to vote unless medicated for their many mysterious illnesses. Shall they vote? Shall they practice law? Gosh, shall they compete with men? You know, they better have this elixir in order to do that. The ads were used to, they used suffrage to advertise their wares. Most of these elixirs contained a high percentage of alcohol. 28%, I think, 28 to 30% alcohol in these elixirs. More advertising? No, they did not attack policemen. In fact, policemen attacked them. And this is kind of interesting because you see that the goddess on the left, or on your left, looks very dignified, and the frantic suffragist is in the back wanting to vote. And on the right, the message, of course, is if you did not follow the expectation of being a sweet young thing, the nasty result was not finding a life partner, and even worse, it was becoming a suffragist. This is one of my favorite pieces. It's the Old Maid. It's a deck of cards that was produced for the game Old Maid, which I played as a kid, and it didn't really fizz me, but this card game shows that the Old Maid was the suffragist who voted. I was looking at this and I thought, well, this is a victory. I don't think that was the point that was being made in this game. The ballot is a delusion. The anti-suffrage New York State Association opposed to women's suffrage. This was their one of their the posters that they circulated. hugging a delusion. So there were reports of other states granting suffrage. They are surfacing in our newspapers, making the news. And we have Wyoming, only in 1900, okay? Only Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. However, things were going to be changing. And in Plattsburgh, many suffragists came to Clinton County to support the movement. Reverend Anna Shaw, these women all have books written about them. So I mean, I don't go into all their lives for sure, but Inez Mulholland is known more perhaps to us because of her, she's buried in Lewis, and Carrie Chapman Catt, for example, was the one that sort of shepherded President Wilson into supporting suffrage when it came time to vote in 1919. So they came here to visit Plattsburgh. They came to Plattsburgh. There were more here, John Temple Graves, and then John Mulholland, who was the father of Inez, came. It's interesting to note, John Mulholland's diary says that he had dinner with the Booths. He was friends with the Booths, Marie and Judge John Booth, who were both active in the suffrage movement here. Marie Booth is one of our fabulous five. And John Mulholland came to Plattsburgh before and after Inez died in 1916. We had motivational suffrage speakers that came in to help or to hinder, and Marjorie Dorman was definitely one that came with a purpose. She'd spoken against suffrage in front of the US Congress, but other women came in from states already that already had full suffrage, like Colorado and here in Washington State in 1915. And there were new groups that formed in the county. But the one interesting one I found was the Women's Civic League of the Chamber. Its members were of described as being of a social and executive prominence. I'm not sure exactly what that meant, but it was a description used to describe them. It was the first time women were allowed to join the Chamber of Commerce, and their vague mandate was to concentrate on making the city more livable. But the first function of this group was to hold it. They had a speaker, Inez Mulholland, come to speak, and coincidentally, suffragist Marie Booth was the first chair of the group. And later a suffragist, which you'll hear about, Lillian Pike Everest, was president of this group. So this was really, was it a hidden, a disguised suffrage group? I don't know. But the fact is that in this group were also anti-suffragists. So it's in, I see these anti-suffragists and suffragists overlapping throughout the story of suffrage in Clayton County. And both, Keene had an anti-suffrage association, Plattsburgh. And coincidentally, though, the suffragists set up an office right next, there's a Hager block on Clinton Street. And the Hager block was owned by anti-suffragist Judge Frank Hager, my great-grandfather. And right next door to his building was the suffrage office. So I thought that was kind of cool. And this is in my great-grandfather's book. And among other things, he was against educating women beyond men because it would cause the women to shun domestic work and therefore disrupt the family. And as interesting, his girls went to the Plattsburgh Normal School and his boys went to Union College. And there were others out there. This was in the early 1900s. This was posted on the Plattsburgh Daily Press's women's page about our freakish demonstrations. And yes, this was part of a lecture given to a class of girls graduating from a high school by their keynote speaker. And this bishop was considered a rabid anti-suffragist, and he said that they will be, he called his suffragists howling and dervish. And this is what these young girls, it was a girls' school, had listened to on graduation day. But you know, it must have been stressful for certainly to have important religious representatives documenting their positions against suffrage, you know, defining women's dignity as related to the home. And so, and this cardinal went on to do, you know, on up the church hierarchy. And it's, so it must have been hard for people to hear this. In cartoons, the man was always made to look so hard done by, you know, and the woman not interested in her family. And insults like women being emotional, short-sighted, and illogical creatures who would endanger the safety of our nation if we got the vote. Back to Harriet May Mills and Marjorie Dorman, this was a big debate in town. It was in Plattsburgh, and both these women were nationally known women. And as I mentioned, Dorman spoke before Congress against suffrage. And while she conceded that women were smart enough in this debate, smart enough to do men's work, she didn't feel that men were capable of doing women's work. And she was concerned that women's work would not get done. So apparently, though, according to the newspaper, suffrage, Harriet May Mills was recorded as winning this debate. So it could not be denied, 1914, that the women in more and more states were getting full suffrage. But notice none of them were on the East Coast. You know, our progressive 13 colonies aren't to be seen in this list. And most of the area, small towns, held the suffrage meetings. At least 11 had been documented by now. And but you know, the attendees for these were Mrs. John so-and-so, Mrs. William so-and-so, Mrs. Stevens so-and-so. The spouses were part of the story, whether they wanted to be or not, because the proper way to address a woman was through her husband's name if she was married. Here's one of our terrific, fabulous five that actually you'll see a picture of Ellen Adams in the director at the minor, the Alice was reenacted Dot this past summer, and Dot was another personality, and she's still remembered by her family as being very directive in her old age. She felt that if a woman can vote on a child's education, why not on child labor? If a woman can vote for a new school, why not a new post office? Why cannot women vote for it all? And as she was a reporter, she provided articles for the newspaper on suffrage. She was born in Dannemora, and but worked in Plattsburgh, and she was the great aunt of Kit Booth's great aunt, and so and the sister to Marie Parkhurst, and the two of them together were strong suffragists in our community. Anyway, she marched in the New York City a parade, suffrage parade, and she was the first woman employed by the War Department for the balance. She was the head of the balance of supply division of the War Department. That means something to people in war. I think she provided the supplies. This was a big deal. Later, she toured abroad studying economic conditions of women and was the president of the New York State Federation of Women's Clubs. And she went on to actually be the congressional secretary of the National League of Women Voters. And she was friends with Carrie Chapman Catt and was appointed by her to be the head of the Clinton County League of Women Voters. And this is her sister, Marie Parkhurst Booth, who was a strong suffrage from day one. She and her husband, John Booth, were at and managed many meetings, and her home was known to have welcomed overnight guests. So I would love to have seen her guest book, you know. She was chair of the state organization of Women's Club. And these are pictures of these ladies, except for Harriet Bell from the county, Clinton County Historical Association's portrait collection. So the anti-suffrage notes were edited, and they were in the they were in the Plattsburgh Daily Press. And another argument they had was that, gee, if women get the right to vote, they double the number of people that can vote. Oh, they double the cost of voting, and they double the corrupt and ignorant vote. So, you know, there was a no-win situation. Politics is coarse and degrading, and the ability to join different parties would weaken their strength. Her energy would be dissipated. Why bother? So, and to the bitter end, the aunties in town held meetings, and their names were listed too. A number of women listed as aunties, however, went on to become members of the League of Women Voters after we won the right to vote. And my grandmother, who thought Inez Mulholland was a showboater, went on to vote at every opportunity for the rest of her life. So this is the other broad statement that was publicized in the newspaper. We've already enfranchised the mass of men who are unfit to vote. That was our Negro men. And now we'll be doubling this number, you know, this number with all these ignorant women being able to vote. What happened is in Clinton County, they prepared for the first New York State vote in 1915, and they had the largest meeting to date with their former Lieutenant Governor Thomas Conway there and John Temple Graves, and it was a huge meeting. And at this meeting, this is the meeting where Hannah Straight Lansing was acknowledged as the mother of Clinton County suffrage. And she recalled for this meeting the day she first met Susan B. Anthony. These are the banners. You know, we can see banners and headlines all the time, and they were no different in 1915. You know, it's a war, folks. And gee, women want to vote. Women's suffrage is going, not coming. And also, the women lost the vote in New Jersey, but we're fighting hard to the end. And then the vote, November 2nd. 1915. The majority in the state voted against suffrage. 42.9 were for suffrage. And the Clinton County vote. It's evident from the returns that the voters of the county do not, at the present time, believe in equal rights for all. The right to vote was snowed under by nearly 1,500 votes. What's interesting I found about this was that the press has changed. They have changed, and now they're feeling people who vote against suffrage may not, you know, are the bad guys, so to speak. So what happened was they tried again in 1916, 1917. We had more dignitaries come to town, more meetings, and the location, there was a permanent suffrage association location on Clinton Street, right next to my great-grandfather's building. But in 1916, Hannah Straight Lansing died. Like many suffragists, she did not live to vote. But the good news, I guess, there is good news. The Methodists made headlines by officially backing women's suffrage, and the Grange officially backed it too, as did unions of female workers. And finally, the WCTU, the local WCTU, openly supported suffrage. And here we see Lillian Pike Everest, one of our fabulous five, and Marie Parkhurst Booth, who are at this meeting. The suffrage tent. They had tents at the reservation, and I found out from this clipping that they had a tent in 1915, which was when they needed it. They were trying to recruit people to vote for the 1915 election, but that didn't happen. But they had a tent at the military reservation. They were serving them tea. They had furniture there. At the end, after the final vote in 1917, they auctioned off all the equipment from this tent, and there were dishes and silverware and furniture and all sorts of things. This was quite a tent, if you ask me. Here, I'm taking a moment to talk about Lillian Pike Everest. My God, she is actually quite lovely. I have to say that. This is a portrait from the CCHA portrait collection. And she was born in Scioto and somehow got to school at the University of Colorado in Denver. And she went to the School of Oratory, and then she taught gymnastics in Emerson College in Boston. And she was a teacher, a DAR member, but one of the founders of Plattsburgh Little Theater. But what she did when she came back to town, being out west, Edgar Everest went out. He was from Champlain. He must have known her, went out to marry her and came back, and they came back to town. Lucky us, because she came back into town and was immediately caught up in the suffrage movement. And again, here we have Inez Milholland, died in 1916. She never had the right to vote. She devoted her life to suffrage. And 1917, so we're building now toward New York, and again having the opportunity to vote for suffrage in the November 1917 election. The Plattsburgh Sentinel in February devoted a whole issue to suffrage. This was a map, an image that is pretty popular. But you notice, there's nobody on the East Coast had the right to vote. And then these names don't mean anything much to anybody, except that we're so busy. They had meeting after meeting on suffrage. So people were really trying to convince the voter. And then finally, as I say, Wilson finally found out which side of the bread was buttered, and finally started to support the the right of New York women to vote. And so that was probably one of the turning points for New York State women. And there were more headlines. See, we're suffs. We were called suffs. We were worse than silly. We were in an army and arrested and defeated in Maine and in Indiana. So these are the headlines that were in the newspapers in 1917. And then we had our final push, and that was when the Sentinel devoted an addition to suffrage. Margaret Foley from the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association came in, Lenny Carl, and these two women went around the county promoting suffrage. And we were assigned a woman, Edna Wright. She was assigned to the area by the New York State Women's Suffrage Party, and she was there in every single meeting. Her name was in the paper a lot. And when she finished, she went on to help them in DC to get the vote for women across the nation. And we had rallies in 1917, every town. And there was the instruction in the newspaper to tell men how to vote for women's suffrage. And then the stores were still making fun of the fact that if women were as anxious to vote as they were to trade at our store, they would have had the ballot long ago. And the county WCTU supported suffrage. And then November 6th. November 6th, the suffrage, and this, I'm going to read this because this was a similar thing was written in the 1915 when they lost the vote. The suffragists, they had in 1915, they had the same enthusiasm as they had in 1917, and they were confident of the success of the polls at both the city and the county. At all meetings held in the campaign, speakers were warmly received. They have every reason to believe that the men of the city and the county will vote to grant women the ballot today. And these ads were in the newspaper. Men of New York, cast your votes for your women. And the other thing is, they were called watchers, and they had women as voluntary for this list. Not all of them, because we had 150 plus, but many of them are in this list, and our fabulous five are here too. But they would go and sit at the polls to make sure, that everything worked okay. And this, in fact, was the beginning of poll workers. And this happened with this election, and as a result of women doing this kind of thing. Then we had the vote, November 6, 1917 in New York and New York State. I don't know, 53.9% is a little small if you ask me, but it's more than 50, so there you go. We got the right to vote. But in Clinton County, no. Clinton County voted, we only lost by 551 this time. Last time we lost by 1,500. So, we were a little ahead of the game, but, it's kind of sad how confident our women were that the county would vote for suffrage. And Essex wasn't that much better. But they had a margin. They could say they won a margin by 15 votes. The 19th Amendment comes, and that's the next move for women, introduced in Congress in 1878, and 41 years later. In 1919, Congress approved the amendment and submitted it to the states for ratification. And New York ratified it right away. Do you know Vermont didn't ratify theirs until 1921, the winter of 1921. Carrie Chapman Catt, the friend of Dot Parkhurst, to get the word male in effect out of the Constitution cost women of the country 52 years of pauseless campaign. And that's right after the Civil War she's talking about. And pauseless is in fact what it was. So here's the Clinton County suffrage story. We have our local heroes, and that are probably not on anybody's list, but they are on our list because we respect what they did. And for them, we continue to tell the story of a battle fought and won and a job well done. And this is this was last summer. And on your left, going left to right, is Hannah Lansing, played by Jan Kuchar. Dot Parkhurst, played by Alan Adams. Susan B. Anthony came by Linda McKenney. Inez Milholland by Sandra Weber. And me as Hattie Bell, Harriet Bell. So thank you for listening. And thank you for helping commemorate the struggle, the success of these women.